continue down the road of dissecting Final Fantasy VII, we're treating this game like some sort of unhinged Hojo experiment, getting down to the cellular level to see what really makes this game tick. Apologies for the belabored analogy, but it's been a lot of Final Fantasy VII over the last few months. But this week's episode is no exception to that rule. From the early themes of corporate greed and environmental espionage to the overarching ideas of life versus death, Final Fantasy VII's story covers a wide swath of emotional ground in some unexpected and unconventional ways. And based on your personal opinion and taste, for better or for worse. Time to toss on our lab coat, brush off the Jenova project, and see if we still have some leftover Mako chilling in the fridge as we continue dissecting in episode 124, Final Fantasy VII Part 6, Story and Themes.
The storyline covers 3 CDs, over 30 cities, hundreds of characters, and thousands of different environments. You'll get hooked right away. The story centers around one guy, but you've got 9 to choose from. And you've never had a battle experience in an RPG until you played this game. Believe me, we're talking magic summoning spells, special skills, tons of weapons, everything from the Knights of the Round Table to the devil himself.
Starting us off on our journey is the one and only Julian from Stage Select Podcast as he discusses the opening story, inherent edginess, and the overall tonal shift of the entire franchise. I think Final Fantasy VII for sure marks a change in tone and grew up with those gamers. That was Absolutely. The game that grew up with us. And I respect it a lot for that because even though, yeah, it's got the swearing, the mature themes of that story and the places that story goes and the complexity, it's a pretty, I mean, that story that jumps times all over the place. It's always going back and forth and back and forth. There's a lot going on in that story. I respect it for being that bridge game that for kids to becoming adults. It felt like it was very of its time, which I think is why it was part of why it was so successful. Oh, absolutely. And I think the core like impetus of the story, at least how it starts out, is that actually is even more relevant now than it was in 1997, right? Like the idea of the evil, money-hungry corporation literally sucking the planet dry, right? And knowing that it's bad for the planet, but not caring because the profits are so good, right? Like I got that as a teenager, but like now it's like, oh man, okay, like, this is really relevant to everything. Yeah, that's an interesting. I mean, this is the game that definitely started that trend. This is the sea change of the Final Fantasy series. This is the giant hinge. So when you state that this is probably the most important Final Fantasy, yeah, I don't think there is much of an argument for that, for sure. As much as I will, criticize the game now for a lot of things, like both of its design and also what it meant for the series going forward, I will never take away how impactful it was or how monumental it was. And I will never take away from people's love of it, right? No, like, absolutely not. Yeah, I think I do have an issue, like, just like there's Final Fantasy fans and there's Final Fantasy VII fans, Bill. That's fair. And Final Fantasy VII fans kind of really turned me on Final Fantasy VII, like back in the day, because they got obsessed with it in a way that like, I get it. I just can't follow you there. Yeah. And I won't take anything away from you. Like if this is your favorite of all time, it's a great game to be your favorite of all time. Yep. Like totally understandable, especially if it was your first one. Yep. You never had a chance. Like, holy crap. This thing was amazing. Yeah. And it's still amazing. It's just, again, I feel that there was a lot that was lost in the transition from 16-bit sprites to 3D polygons. And
we never really got it back. We got it back for a split second with Final Fantasy IX, but that wasn't even supposed to be a mainline Final Fantasy when they started making it. And then we kind of see it in little bits and pieces here with other games like Bravely Default or Octopath Traveler. But really, like, Final Fantasy as a franchise, it's like, no, we're this now. We're Hollywood.
Yeah.
And
it's
for better or for worse.
For better or for worse. And I think that's a good place to land the plane, because that really is, it really depends on what you got introduced to. You're right. I can't imagine being 11. My last guest who I was talking to, he played this when he was 11. No chance. No chance.
Absolutely not.
There's no way. Like,
yeah.
And that's
Sephiroth imprinted upon you. Like, it's in your DNA now. Like, there's nothing you can do about it.
But I find very interesting. I'm actually going to be talking to a Sephiroth cosplayer next week who I think it's going to be very interesting to get her opinion on Sephiroth and that connection. So I find it fascinating. And look, you said how you say you're not going to take away from people who do love this game. There are people who love 8, and I don't understand. I couldn't do it. And there's people who are chomping at the bit to talk about 8. They are like, when we talk about 8, I'm in because I love that game. I'm like,
yeah.
I think it's going to be as not quite as meta as the Chrono Trigger episode, but it might be an episode of people convincing me why I should try Final Fantasy 8 again. It might be just people trying to convince me to give it one more try.
It's one of my least favorite in the series, but it is the number one game that I'm most interested in revisiting because I know I played it wrong when it came out. I don't know. I want to figure out how to play it right.
I don't know. I have to keep playing 9. I fell off of 9 for a bit, but I really enjoyed it. I was enjoying 9 a lot.
Yeah.
I do want to finish that one properly. 8, I'm like, I gave it a solid 3 hours. Julian, and that's from in dad time. That's precious.
And you saw the intro, like, you're good.
Yeah,
like that is still one of the best intros. Like,
it's pretty incredible.
Yeah, no, you got the gist of it.
I got the gist of it. The junction system is extremely confusing, and I don't understand it. And I'm not.
Squall's a jerk.
Squall's a jerk, and I don't want to hang out with him. So great. And Triple Triad is fine.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's fine. Anyway,
there's a reason why, like, I left GamePro and Nintendo Power and gravitated towards EGM, then flipped over to Die Hard for my, because they were, like, edgier. But then when I got, like, a little bit more mature, I went back to EGM in a big way. And I was like, oh no, EGM has actually matured with me as well. And, like, this feels like a magazine for adults. And I felt that way with video games as well. Like, and I think that's what the PlayStation represented for me, was a lot of the big games on the PlayStation were games for older teenagers and adults. And, and I was like, well, this is what I want. This is, I think if games had just, if we just had the Nintendo 64, I probably would have ended up falling off of video games in this time.
Interesting.
Because I would have been like, okay, these are fun, but I'm not really being challenged, like, either gameplay wise or really mentally. And I think I'm done. Like, I think I'm good. And I would have probably come back to them later, but as it is, like, I've never fallen off of video games in, like, since I first got my hands on a controller. And I think a big part of that is that I felt the games kind of aging up with me.
Yeah, and it's very interesting you say that. And again, this is a slight diversion, but that's perfectly fine. I like these conversations when they come up. I was very different in that I matured. I was the same age as I was 17 in 97. So I think you and I are the same age basically. And I matured a lot later in life than a lot of my peers because I think a lot of it had to do with I had very young brother and sister. My brother and sister were both 5 and 6 years younger. So they were still kids. So whenever I was doing stuff with the family, we were still doing kid stuff. Like, I was never real, and I didn't have a very large social circle. My mom did not allow me to hang out with people at, like, high school. So I didn't have, like, high school hangout friends. So I was always home with my younger brother and sister, still doing younger kid things. So for me, Nintendo was still appealing. And so for me, but I did have that drop off when I was in college where I really didn't play a lot of games. I played some GoldenEye and I was very casually playing, but I didn't have, I definitely had that drop off. Like I never had a PlayStation. I only had a PS2 because my brother wanted to play GTA. So
yeah, that's how you turn into a well-rounded adult, Bill. See, if you go down my route, if you spec the way that I spec'd, you know a lot about video games at the expense of everything else.
Oh, please. In college, all I did was do radio and pretend we were Howard Stern on the radio and try to be edgy. And yeah.
I'm sure knowing how to do radio has not helped you at all with anything else that you've done since.
This is fair. Fair point. But I will say there is a big swath though of video games that I just don't have a personal attachment to. Like sure, even when with PS2, my brother, who again at the time he was probably 18, and I lived at home pretty much until I was in my mid 20s, all through college. I didn't go away to college. I went to school very close to where I grew up, my hometown, and I was getting back into games through my younger brother, who was like, "Oh, I want to play GTA. I want to play The Getaway," which we still quote to this day because it's fantastic and fabulous and silly and strange. But anyway, diversion. Man, what other thought? I want to just hear you just go on about Final Fantasy VII because I know you got thoughts, man, and I don't think you've exhausted them all. So,
oh yeah, I mean,
yeah, fire away, man.
You know, again, like I loved it at the time, but I really felt. Like I said, years later, and it was really like once Final Fantasy VIII came out, and I kind of saw what Final Fantasy VIII was, and that's when I realized how much we had lost with Final Fantasy VII. And I know you don't talk a lot about mechanics in the series, but I think it's worth mentioning how slight Final Fantasy VII is on that.
Interesting, because I am going to have a section on mechanics because it's been coming up more and more with this particular game, so this is perfectly fine. What's your take on it?
Going down to 3 party members was a big blow for me, especially since my favorite was a game where you could have up to 5 party members in Final Fantasy IV. And then those characters kind of all being blank slates with the materia system. Like I understand that the materia system gives you a lot of flexibility in how you want to build your character, but the Magicite system in 6 also gave you that, but the characters still had distinct roles and abilities that were unique to them. Where the characters in 7, they have their limit breaks and they have their unique weapons, and that's about it. And this is going to sound counterintuitive, like to what I just said, but bear with me. The fact that they each only have like a weapon that they can equip, I think also takes away from them where, you know, I always like the idea of like, well, okay, this character is a warrior, so they can equip any type of weapon. Right. You know, this character is a mage, so they're going to use daggers or staffs or sometimes a bow and arrow, but that's about it. But there is that little flexibility there where you can do different things with them in accordance with their jobs. Where, you know, there's not really, the characters don't really have like a job per se. I mean, there isn't. Yeah, definitely. Right. I mean, obviously, like Sid is a dragoon, right? Right down to the fact that his last name is Highwind, which ties into other Highwinds that had been dragoons in the series before, and later on. But for the most part, they're just kind of blank characters when it comes to combat until you load them up with materia, and then they kind of double down on that with Final Fantasy VIII. And then, you know, when we got to 9, where then we once again had characters that were very bespoke and had unique utility in battle. Yeah, I was like, oh no, this is we've lost so much. Yeah, I think also equipment wise, right? Like all of a sudden, it's like you have a weapon, a piece of armor, and an accessory. Yeah, because like even though like it was only it was, you know, it didn't change your character visually. In my head, playing Final Fantasy IV, like when I would get to the end of the game, and I was like, "Oh man, Cecil probably looks so cool with his diamond armor and shield and gloves and everything, right?" And you know, now it's like, okay, yeah, you can see the Cloud has a new weapon. That was very cool, but they also had been doing that in the series for years anyway. Like the weapons would definitely change. Yep. But then it's like, okay, and he's got like a new, you know, I guess he's wearing a new like wrist guard. That's neat. I don't know. It really felt like a big step back, but in the moment, it didn't feel like that because those visuals. Right.
Next up, content creator Mekel Kasanova discusses Final Fantasy VII's less than linear storytelling and attempts to uncover if it hurt or helped the final product. Let's listen in. Well, that's a great segue into the story of Final Fantasy VII. In preparation for this series, I watched a chronological retelling of Final Fantasy VII, the story. So it kind of started from the very beginning all the way through. And when I watched that, my thought was oh, wow, I forgot there's a character named Hojo that's really the big bad. I forgot about Rufus. I forgot about this person. And the way I've been describing it to my other guests is, if the original Final Fantasy games were these straight line stories with paths that would converge and diverge and, but you still had this one path, Final Fantasy VII is like this coiled mass of, it's like the strands of time in the second season of Loki. It's this big, there's a through point. There's this, but it's inside of it. It's all this stuff interwoven. And I just remember the story being very confusing playing it as a late 20 something on my PS3, being I don't understand what's going on here, but there's so much cool stuff in that story. I think the storytelling, what's your take on the storytelling of Final Fantasy VII? Because for me, there's a lot of cool stuff in there that gets really lost in all the time jumps and the flashbacks and all that. What's your take on it?
So when I was playing that back then, I literally had a notebook to write stuff down.
Wow.
Because I think I said before, with the translation of English and from Samoan to English, or vice the other way around. There's a lot of it where I didn't understand it, and some of the terms were words that I didn't know. So I would write them down or write down characters, and I would go to my older brothers and I'd be like, "Can you explain what this is to me? I don't what is the English? What does this mean in Samoan, or what is what is this?" The context of it, because I was young, and like I said, I was a third grader at the time. I didn't really completely comprehend it. But no, it was, the narrative was not, and I don't think it even is now. I think it's even worse now if you look at Remake and Rebirth. It was very all over the place, because there was way too many plot threads that were going on. Like you said, the flashbacks, the whole thing when Cloud would hear the voice, it was never clear in the original whose voice that was.
Sure, you're right.
So I didn't know who. I'm wait, who is that? There's no context of that. Okay, why does not anyone else other than Cloud understand what that is? And they don't really dive into what's going on with Cloud until midway through disc 2. End of disc, the closing towards the end of disc 2. Yeah. So there's a lot of stuff that was just, I didn't get that. They would throw Hojo in there and make it seem like he was very important, then pull him out, then throw him back in, then sometimes make him seem like he was just a joke character, he's a lesser Kefka, which I still kind of view him as a lesser Kefka in many ways. But anyways,
you can make that argument. You can make that argument. Yeah.
It's so I would look at it and I'm just I don't really understand that. Then you had Hedegar, and then Scarlet, and then you had Reeve, and then when they brought in Kate Sith, and maybe this is a translation issue, because now I'm thinking about this. When you got to the Temple of the Ancients, and you had Kate Sith take the Black Materia, the Temple of the Ancients collapsed upon itself. You had a cutscene where Kate Sith was like, "Oh, but there's only one me. I am." No, he had a actualization, self-realization. Right. I was I was confused. I was wait, but I thought he was controlled by Reeve. And I was so confused. And then right after that, then you have another Kate Sith come, "Oh, I'm Kate Sith number da 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 da." And I'm
right, yeah. The game doesn't do itself a lot of favors. It really doesn't when it comes to its storytelling. I feel like Final Fantasy VII is the first time the developers had seemingly unlimited resources.
Yeah.
Like the doors are blown off. You have as many CDs as you want. You got 3 CDs, you got 3 CDs. You want 10, go for 10. Who cares? All the doors are blown off of it. And with all that stuff, I think they put lots of stuff in there, but they lost the efficiency of those original 6 Final Fantasy games. And I think that's like the key word for me is like efficiency. Because like Final Fantasy IV, like we discussed, that game is tight. Like that narratively is tight. It's so good. And 6, it's a little more bloated, but it's still tight, right? Like you have very clear things going on. 7 always felt confusing, even though when you look at it from like that chronological standpoint and you see it like just presented as a complete story, you go, oh, wow, that's actually really cool. There's a lot of cool stuff in there. But man, does it get lost behind the big swords and the spectacle of it. That's for me.
No. I mean, I'm completely there with you with that because it did not do. I mean, I think it was it Ted Woosley? Was he the translator for that? So
he
it's
was
like
the translator for. Yeah, I think he still was translating for 7. I believe. Yes.
Okay, so like I feel like just with the translation, there's a lot of stuff that just got lost. I mean, a lot of people are like, oh, Aerith Gainsborough, but in the game, in the manual, she was was Eris, I believe. Eris, yeah.
Eris, yep.
Yeah, and so it's like there was it was so many different things, like characters. Like I said, they then when they brought in characters who should be very important, such as Professor Gas and Ilfana, they're presented and then there's nothing else. You know, it's like, oh, okay, but you're supposed to, remember that Lucrezia, and like there's so many things that were optional, which I feel like should not have been optional. Vincent and Yuffie, like because that gives you so much more of an understanding, but easily you could miss it. I mean, getting Yuffie, if you didn't have a guide or you weren't just roaming around, you never would have gotten her. There's no indication of how to get her. Same thing I feel like with Vincent when you go to Nibelheim and go to the mansion, easily missable. Yep. And then like that side quest of finding Lucrezia in the cave, how would you even know? You would not have known that she was a mother of Sephiroth. Like it just, that was just a detail. Oh, okay, yeah, it's cool if you want to go find that. Same thing with Zack and how important Zack is. And in the version we got, apparently international version, it happens automatically. That's a completely missable cutscene. So like I remember first time I played it and I beat it, I never got the Zack ending. Or not Zack ending, but that Zack cutscene. So when I play Guys, which, hey, if you know, that was a fun game back in the day. Kind of broken, but it was a lot of fun, especially in arcades. When I unlocked Zack, I was like, who's this guy? And I was like confused. I'm like, why does he look like Cloud? And then come to find out, I went through, I think GamePro had a whole article on him or on the game, and that he was in there. How to unlock all the Final Fantasy characters, and they brought up he was a soldier, and I was like, wait, what? And then they talked about, oh yeah, and if you go back to Nibelheim after a certain part in Disc 2, then you can go and have that cutscene trigger. And I was like, what? There was nothing to tell you that.
No, it's very strange. But again, and that's why I think, and we can kind of transfer to Cloud a little bit. I never liked playing as Cloud. I never enjoyed being in that character, and you really don't get a good redemptive arc until you're like 2/3 of the way through, where you start realizing what's going on. I think if they hadn't held those cards so close to the vest, that they had let that on a little earlier, you'd be like, oh wow, he's struggling with basically 2-3 people's worth of memories rattling around in his head, and all that stuff again is interesting because it creates this character that becomes very sympathetic. Even Sephiroth is pretty sympathetic towards the end. He's just basically a puppet of Jenova and Hojo. But you don't get any of that.
Some of the Final Fantasy lore people, those YouTubers and them essays, they They gonna hear that? Actually,
Yeah, fair. I will. Let me deliver my actually. That's my actually. It's been used by my friends at Gamers Week podcast. I'm officially a drop on their show. Whenever someone gets actually, you hear me doing actually. That's my contribution to the world of voiceovers is my actually. But yes, you're right. I'm probably sure I screwed that up. But I feel like Final Fantasy VII, the bigness of that game and the event status of that game almost did it a disservice in its storytelling, because again, whenever I talk to people about this game, the main thing are like the Cloud and the Sephiroth in the opening, and again, it's world class. Like the opening of Final Fantasy VII is world class. It is phenomenal. And I've played it recently, and it still holds up, and it's still great. But you miss out on all this other stuff, like you said, missing out on Vincent's backstory with his I think with his mother, right? I think with his mother, and you're like, if missing out on that stuff, Vincent is just maybe a go-go. He's just a person. But if you miss out on that piece, he's just like a cool little side vampire character. Like, that's cool. Mm-hmm. It's really wild, and I think the bigness of that game again dilutes or masks all the interesting stuff it was trying to do, which there is quite a bit of interesting stuff it's trying to do. It just doesn't come across as easily as it did in the other versions.
No, it really didn't. And it's like when you look at stuff like Red 13 or Nanaki's Tribe, then you go to Cosmo Canyon, and you learn about his father Seto and going up against the I forgot the name of that tribe. They were like ghosts or something like that, because you could that boss, if you threw a phoenix down at him.
Oh, right. Oh, I don't
I can't think of the name of that tribe, but like there's a backstory that they kind of built up there, and then never touched on again.
Right.
And I'm like, wait, okay, interesting. And then with the whole weapons, they didn't really dive into that as much. Like, okay, wait, the weapons are the planet's defense, but why are they going around destroying? Wait, what?
Yeah.
What?
Yeah. It feels like, again, there's a lot of ideas. The doors were open. Can we make a giant weapon? Sure. By all means, weapon away. But it's in this like big cauldron, this big cylindrical cauldron of all these threads that are mixed in with each other, and it's honestly hard to decipher. It really is. To a certain extent.
Really is.
I mean, for me, again, I'm playing this as a 29-year-old. Like I wasn't of its age, so that's why I always find it interesting to talk to people who played of its time and those big fans. Because again, I watched a YouTube video where it explains everything, and I'm like, oh, I don't remember. I remember a Rufus, but I don't remember him doing all this stuff. I remember a Hojo, but I don't remember any of this stuff. This is actually pretty cool. Like, this is good fiction. I dig this. And I think that's part of the problem.
Yeah. The narrative needed to be a lot tighter. And I think they could have done it. And I feel like by them not only not making it tighter, but then going so far as to, with the compilation of Final Fantasy, and expanding upon things. Because, okay, I don't mind if you want to clear up questions a lot of us had, because I'm sorry, that game had a lot of questions we had no answers to. And certain things, like, I know apparently people hate Crisis Core now. I'm like, I love it. I love Zack as a character, and it really, I felt like, gave us additional context. Same thing with Before Crisis, letting us know about the Turks. It's when you start shifting the narrative into something it's, it never originally was. And I know I'm upset. The remake, there's a lot of remake fans. Yeah, a lot of YouTubers that built careers off of remake and rebirth, and I'm just like,
yep.
I'm just like, look, I'm happy that you guys are happy for it, and you like it and enjoy it. But this is not the Final Fantasy VII I grew up with, and like when I saw a remake, I was like, oh, it's a subtitle. It's not a literal remake. And then people are like, no, it's a remake. Yeah, you don't need to play the original. Sure you don't.
Yeah, you got.
Sure you don't.
I can't even. Yeah. It's not a replacement. It's not a replacement in any way, shape, or form.
It's a continuation. The game literally says it when it starts showing all the events from the original and the extended universe that they built, including stuff from Final Fantasy X with Shinra.
Right.
Which was, okay, why Square Enix, why did you tie Shinra from 10 to...
Why'd you do that? It is time once again to say thank you to our wonderful patrons, starting with Seth Sergil of the All In Media Network, Julian of Stage Select, Tim Knowles, formerly of The Elitist, BT Goebbels, the Let's Play Princess of Nerds A Broadcast, Games with Coffee, Greg Seward of the Player One Podcast and Generation 16 series of videos, Terry Kinnair, the one and only Joe Coro of Joe Cade and Perfect Storm Gaming, Philip Becker, Lindsay Harney, and the one and only editor extraordinaire, Pete Harney. If you would like to join these amazing human beings, mosey on over to patreon.com/a gamer looks at 40, check out the tiers, and sign up today. And if not, a rating or review on your pod player of choice is always greatly appreciated. Continuing our conversation is the Let's Play Princess of Nerds A Broadcast, followed by Matt and Geoff of the Fun and Games Podcast. So what was your first impressions when you popped it in and started playing it? And you said you're about 16?
Oh, God, no. This would be around the age of 11 to 13.
Oh, 11. Okay, so earlier. Okay. So yeah. So what was your first impression?
It was really cool. I loved the graphics. I loved the gameplay style of the ATB bar and filling it up, and the idea that you could actually hold circle to make it fill up just a little bit faster, memory serves.
Uh-huh.
And I really enjoyed that the manual actually gave you an idea of how bosses worked. It gave you the little guide to the end of the first bombing run.
Oh, did it really? That's interesting.
The instruction manual gives a guide for the first bombing run up until and including the Scorpion Sentinel, Scorpion Tank, whatever they called it back then.
Yeah.
So it actually tells you, hey, when its tail is raised, don't attack it. Do you have the Thunder Materia? Use it.
Oh, that's interesting. So they actually put some information in there for newer gamers who may not be so used to an RPG. That's interesting. I didn't know that it did that. That's smart.
Yeah, and God, later on, that game for me, because I wasn't, power leveling or really going after specific things, because I didn't know what I was looking for. So it was actually a lot harder, probably for me, than what a lot of people might be saying in their stories. I probably hard reset, started this game 3 separate times.
Wow.
Once at Gnatic, once at the Materia Keeper in Nibelheim, and then once at, I can't remember the name of it, but the crane robot boss that's in the underwater reactor.
Uh-huh. Yep.
And I remember somebody in 6th grade actually had the strategy guide for this game.
Nice.
So 2 years later after I'm playing it, I'm at Gnatic, I've reset the game a few times, and it's just like, wait a minute, okay, so what am I doing wrong? Is there a thing to this? And somebody had the guide, and I'm like, hey, you have that real quick. Did you beat this boss? And they go, yeah. I go, cool. What is there some special thing you can do and everything? They just go, use a Phoenix down. I went, what? I remember that 6 is my favorite Final Fantasy, but it's not my first. This was my first. So I didn't have that idea of, hey, ghost enemies take damage to the curing spells.
Oh, that's awesome. That's right. And that's pretty far along in the game, if I'm not mistaken. Again, I've been refreshing myself on Final Fantasy VII. I attempted to run through, and then the version on Steam I bought broke, and I lost progress, and I said, that's enough of that. But
How did the Steam version break?
it broke. I don't know what happened. I can't get past it's early on too. It's after the first couple hours when you're in, after you blow up the second reactor, you have to go around and you have to find something, and he says find somebody's in a bar, but this person in the bar never triggers, never shows up. So now I can't get past it because it's right before you do all of the weird stuff at the Honeybee Inn or whatever that's called.
Okay, so it was like right before
Super
squats and getting the vitamins for the
yeah.
people and all that fun stuff. You were just getting to Wall Market, but just past the Airbuster. Okay.
Yeah. So super early on, so I didn't like lose a ton of progress, but for some reason the character and I looked it up, and they're like, yeah, it just this character is supposed to be there for you to talk to do the little handoff, and sure enough, I was not able to. So I was like, you know what, forget it. I don't know. Maybe my Steam Deck did something weird. I don't know. But anyway, anyway, so I've been refreshing myself on the story as over the last couple of days in preparation for these interviews. But so yeah, I think I have a pretty decent handle on that. I played it when I was like my 30s on the PS3. They had when they had the PS3 store where you could buy the PlayStation 1 classics, the PS1 classics digitally. So I downloaded one day. I'm like, let me see what this Final Fantasy VII is all about. And I liked it. I thought it was fine. I'm like, this is good. Found it very confusing story-wise. I've since learned more about the story, but yeah, that's interesting. As an 11-year-old, did the story confound you at all? Because that story goes back and forth and forward and back, and it's jumping all over the place. Really?
I always grew up with harder hitting books. My mom had me reading and, starting to talk when I was around 2.
Oh, wow.
So around this time would be Artemis Fowl.
Wow.
Maybe even my first iteration of getting into Stephen King.
Okay. Wow. That's super advanced for 11. Wow, that's really cool. So you already understood story structure well enough. I remember just thinking, wow, this is just jumping all over the place, and it was cool. Again, I'm 30. I should know much better, but I can imagine for like a set for someone younger like that, it'd be a challenge. But you found it was pretty easy to follow. Okay, interesting. When's the last time you played the original Final Fantasy VII?
Oh God. I load up the file when I visited back home is the question. Because the answer is yes, 7 years ago.
Okay. So 7 years ago. So that's still relatively recently, a lot sooner than I have. Does it hit for you differently now as more of an adult as it did 7 years ago? Or sorry, as it did when you were a kid, sorry.
No, it's still a great game.
Interesting. Cool.
It aged very well in my mind.
Yeah.
And now we have these even, I don't want to say better, they're different. But Remake and Rebirth definitely hold the charm at points and the exploration. They know what they're doing.
Yeah, and I think, again, I haven't played those two games, but from what I understand, they're not replacements, but they're great companion pieces.
Yes.
To the original game.
Yes, they are.
That's kind of the prevailing opinion I've heard on those, that they're worthwhile companion pieces.
The only potentially negative thing you can say about them is that the second one is maybe a little bloated, and some of the stuff could have been saved for part 3 because there's a lot of side quests in that game.
I heard it's a ton of side quests. Going off the main thread. Yeah, I've heard that about the second one. But yeah, I will be playing those at some point in my life when time allows. Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I find it interesting that does this game, you think, hold up more than other Final Fantasy games for you?
Oh, well, that's a good question. I think it holds up as well as 6 does, which is perfectly. Now, there's probably some things in Final Fantasy VII that don't hold up as much. Like, I remember fondly the prison escape with Tifa. But at the end of the day, that is a weird combination of button presses because you're controlling each individual part of her body. This was QWOP before QWOP came out. Or, man, the Rebirth version of Mr. Dolphin is a lot better. You don't have to give CPR to anybody.
Oh, really? Okay.
No. I don't know which version of the Junon Parade I like more, though. That's the fun part.
Ooh.
Because you'll see. The originals, marching in place, pressing the buttons as they take the formation, trying to be as one-to-one as possible. But in the new one, it's a rhythm game.
Ooh, I think I'd like the rhythm game probably better. I prefer rhythm games to the button, not the button press. Obviously, they're both button press, but you know what I mean. I prefer a rhythm game. If you're gonna make me do like a side quest like that, make it rhythm based. I'm happy.
So, Bill, you should play Beat Rhythm.
What's this now?
Beat Rhythm?
Oh, Beat Rhythm. Yeah, have I played Beat Rhythm?
The Final Fantasy rhythm game?
No, I have not played this.
Oh, you need it. It's on PS4 or the Switch, the Final Bar line. Both of the 3DS versions are also very good. If somebody out there is selling an arcade cabinet of the arcade version, please email me.
Nice. I'd love to move into Cloud as a character and some of the characters. I think that's a really good transition because when I played it for the first time, I remember thinking the way Final Fantasy VII tells its story can be a little convoluted and confusing. Mm-hmm. But when I researched it again for this series and played it again for this series and watched a chronological retelling of the story, I was taken aback by how much cool stuff is in the story of Final Fantasy VII. Final Fantasy VII is a really cool piece of fiction when you kind of look at it from a bird's eye view and you're not in the middle trying to do levels and such. What's your take? Let's start with story first, then characters, because they're kind of intertwined. What's y'all's take on the story of Final Fantasy VII?
I mean, I think again, being that every kind of game I played that had to do with role playing was very fantasy based, whether it was growing up playing D&D or, like I said, Chrono Trigger has a futuristic bent, but in a different kind of science fiction way. But playing Mario RPG, which is very much rooted in the rules of Mario, whereas this game was big buildings, energy draining the planets, like technology. It was less about magic, even though there was magic, and more about the tech in this world. And I think that that already made me really excited for this story because it just felt so different from anything we had seen before, even though there have been other cyberpunk stories and video games before that, but I don't think quite on the main stage like this was. And the narrative, as far as the narrative goes, I love it. Like I said, the holes I see that other people poke in it most of them are pretty valid. I think for me, the reason I love it so unabashedly is because, again, it was the first time I really felt like the cinematic movie style storytelling in a video game. And also I'm a sucker for emotional beats. There are some truly sad moments in this game. And before getting into the nitty gritty of that, I'm someone who cries at video games. I've cried at video games since I was a kid. And this was one of the first, I would say the second, because Chrono Trigger was probably the first to do it. And that is powerful. And I think the story is really powerful. Is it perfect? No. It's waned as my favorite Final Fantasy. I think 9, after playing it last year, 2 years ago, I really fell in love with that game, especially in the final act. And so that might be my favorite. But also I played 4 for the first time last year, and I really loved 4. I thought it was an incredible story. And I played the Pixel remaster. And so that skyrocketed up my list. And I am a Final Fantasy 16 defender. I really love that game. And so I think Final Fantasy's always had really unique storytelling, and I don't think any of the stories are inherently bad. I think when those games get a bad rap, like 8, which is tough to get through, I don't think it's the story that's the problem. It's not perfect, but I think it's the bouncing off the mechanics. But 7, I think, has become, like Geoff said, the storytelling has become a trope, but it wasn't at the time. It is now, right? Because it was the blueprint. But at the time, I thought the story was great, and I still really quite love it. And I think a lot of that is nostalgia, but a lot of that is also because it was like an originator.
It definitely has that Seinfeld problem of why was this so groundbreaking? Everybody does this, but no one did at the time. Right. But there is something so cool. In Final Fantasy VII's, yeah, like you were saying, Bill, kind of that bird's eye view of the story. And all of the pieces are, in fact, there. Sometimes you really have to go out of your way to watch the sequence of, say, Zack and Cloud escaping from the Nibelheim mansion and making their way to Midgar. That's in the original game. There is so much supplementary material to Final Fantasy VII, and I always have pause when properties, no matter what the medium, are like, well, they release this other thing that totally explains that, so there's nothing wrong with the story. Sure, great, but what about the original presentation?
Right.
Final Fantasy VII has all of those pieces there, and just as disjointed as it is within Cloud's head, it is for us. And whether that is, trying to sound smart to explain anything away, I don't care. That's there.
No, I totally agree. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I like the way that you said that all the pieces are there, and it does take a little bit of effort to mind them. But again, you're playing as a character who has all of his pieces jumbled and shattered and scrambled anyway. So there are some parallels there for sure. And finally, closing out this discussion of all things story and themed is Games with Coffee, followed by James and JJ of RetroFits, then John Trenbeath of the Beat Crohn's Foundation, and finally Eddie Varnell of the Boss Rush Network. As I've been reliving it and again, I've only played through it once, and I tried playing through it again for this podcast, but a Steam version of my game messed up and I lost progress. And I was like, I'm out of time. So what I've been doing is just kind of watching YouTube videos on the story and just kind of refreshing myself on the whole experience. Mm-hmm. So what struck me was a couple of things. One, how complex the story is.
Yes.
Because you are jumping around all over the place time-wise. I mean, you are going forward, back 2,000 years ago. It's a lot of jumping around, which is cool. But also how well integrated all of the personal stories are to the main story.
Yeah.
I would even say more than Final Fantasy VI. The story of Final Fantasy VII has a relatively straight, it doesn't have a straightforward progression. It feels like this complex web that's constantly moving forward. It's like the Blob. Feels like, but in a good way, where it's like all of this richness comes from the interactions with the characters. And whereas Final Fantasy VI feels like, here's your main story, here's your side story. And even modern Final Fantasies, your main story, get your side quests. Then you can do those side quests. In Final Fantasy VII, it doesn't feel like that. Everything feels so closely integrated with the overall experience. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really interesting storytelling. And it makes for a complex game, but also makes for a very rich one because you get those moments where everybody gets a chance to grow and shine.
Yeah, it's like life. It's basically, I mean, that's the theme of the game. It's life. It's life and death. It's, you take the good things in life, and then you also have the bad things in life, and you kind of have to deal with that complexity behind that. Like one of the more interesting things is that Final Fantasy VII has the capability of being both serious and silly at the same time.
Yeah. Yes,
and it just has a way of just presenting the theme of life and how everything is interconnected to one another, that complex web of things where, we have losses on some sides, but, there's some hope, there's joy, there's hope, there's ignorance, there's fear, like all those emotions, you can kind of perceive that through the game. And I mean, like the biggest moment, of course, like when Aerith dies, it's, oh man, it's heart wrenching, and it's funny too because, sorry to interrupt, I mean, that loss actually was indicative of what happened to director Yoshinori Kitase during that time. Not many people know this, but during that time, his mother passed away.
Oh wow!
Right, and that kind of influenced his direction. It kind of influenced the direction of how Final Fantasy VII kind of came about. There's this really fantastic quote, and it's one of the most memorable quotes. In fact, I was almost able to recite it off of memory. Like, I typed it down and everything. I didn't have to look it up. I just remember it from thing. And it goes a little something like this. He says, "In this world, things are very different. You just need to look around you. Nobody wants to die that way. People die of disease and accident. Death comes suddenly, and there's no notion of good or bad. It leaves not a dramatic feeling, but a great emptiness. When you lose someone you loved very much, you feel this big empty space and think, if I had known this was coming, I would have done things differently." And that quote pretty much encapsulates Final Fantasy VII in a nutshell.
Wow. Yeah, you're right. Wow.
Especially when you're talking about like the moments between Cloud and Aerith, like from Sector 6 when they were talking about themselves a little bit on the playground, and Cloud's like, "Oh, who's your boyfriend?" He's like, "Yeah, he was a former soldier." He's like, "Probably knew him. What's his name?" And then they get interrupted. It's like those little moments there.
Yeah.
Like when you're talking with Aerith and she's trying to peel back the layers she's trying to peel back the layers of Cloud's strife to see who the real Cloud is, right? And then that's another conversation like we can go into.
Oh, totally.
The wonderful psyche of Cloud strife.
Yeah, switching gears a little bit to the story of Final Fantasy VII. Some people say it's a mess. Some people love it. What's y'all's take on it? I'll start with you, JJ. What's your take on the story of Final Fantasy VII?
Admittedly, it is a mess. That's because it takes a lot of suspension of disbelief in order to get to like, so we're just gonna have complete control over all the military, all the entire world. There's the other countries have already been lost the war. And we're just going to go and do this stuff, and then this motley crew of 7 people are going to stop us.
Yeah, the 9 eco-terrorists versus the massive worldwide mega corporation that has access to literally all of the weapons in the world. That's not going to end the way that it ends in that game.
You never know. Just a few determined people can topple an empire. I mean, who knows? But you have a good point.
True.
So to your point, though, it's Final Fantasy VII's story. I think is actually really interesting when you look at it from like a chronological standpoint. Like the actual story is actually pretty good, but it's told in such a weird back and forth, jumping back and this and that. Well, yeah, go for it. Go, please.
I think that part of that is by design.
Sure.
Because as Cloud is the main character, it's not always told in such a way that like he's the one telling the stories, but all of the really, really disjointed parts are where it's 100% his perspective. Right. So there's parts of it where like, oh, this makes sense. We're just regular people going on a story. Oh, no, wait, we have to go on this weird tangent where like 5 things that clearly could not have happened back to back are now being told as a single story. Okay, no, we're good. I think
back to it.
I think that having Cloud as the main character, from whose perspective you are supposed to experience the story, having the story be a mess, it's kind of the only way you could write it and still have it like line up with everything else. Because if it was well organized, like if it was like a novel where you like sat down and you edited it and you organized it and you moved chapters around, that were from slightly different perspectives just to have stuff make sense chronologically, then none of the reveals would be that meaningful. It would be like, oh, okay, I had absolutely no clue that something was broken about this person, but I guess we're here now in his mind with like 4 ghost versions of him, and one of them's a kid, and here we are.
Hello. Hey, welcome.
Yeah.
Flashback.
Oh, good. Tifa. Tifa's here to save us. Okay, good.
Okay, good. What about you, JJ? What's your take on the story?
Disjointed hot mess that I absolutely love.
Okay, I love that. Go for it. I love that.
Yeah, because again, it's just with the fact that there's just so much convoluted stuff that you have to accept, and then of course the massive greed and over-the-top villainous that some of the, I mean, not actually, Sephiroth is actually more grounded than President Shinra. And that's saying something.
Totally. Oh,
yeah.
Sephiroth is actually a sad character. It's actually a very sympathetic character. Like,
yeah, absolutely.
He didn't ask for any of this. He's just being used. Opening holds up. Like, it's still good. I played it last month or couple months.
It
still holds up. That opening is fantastic. It drops you right in. Now, you did mention one thing though, that the story can be a little convoluted. What's your take on the story itself and kind of how that articulates in that game?
It maybe tries to do a little bit too much, because it's starting off with you're saving the planet. Go Planeteers. And which was a very 90s thing.
Yes.
Being environmentally conscious was very big in the 90s. Okay, great. We're an eco-terrorist group, even though we're not going to call ourselves that. And we're trying to stick it to the man. And then it delves into, like, legend and history, and the world is ending because someone has mommy issues. And you may or may not actually be who you think you are. You might just be a clone. You don't even have a past, but you do. Or do you? There's a lot. And having played through it again last year, it wasn't as bad as I had it in my head that it was, because I think the internet has kind of changed its mind. Like, it goes back and forth on how the internet feels about Final Fantasy VII. And, the last video I probably watched on it said, it's a little convoluted mess. It's not as good as you think it is, or you remember it. And it's like, oh, maybe it's not. But then I played through it again. And I was like, no, this game's still pretty cool. Some of that story does get a little bit grander than it needs to be, but it holds up, and it's fun. That's the name of the game with video games.
It's key. Fun. That's a key observation, in that it's still very, very fun. I find the story of Final Fantasy VII, and again, for this podcast series, I tried replaying it, and my Steam version messed up, and I lost progress, and I said, that's fine. I got enough of it to get my flavor for it. So I'm watching videos on it, like the story videos, or refreshing myself on the beats. And when you watch the story in chronological order, I watched a video where it's like literally it goes from 2,000 years ago up until the modern time of the actual chronological order of the story. It's actually fascinating and really good. It's really, really, really good fiction. The way the game tells a story, though, through all of these flashbacks and all of these time jumps, when you're in the midst of it, especially when you're trying to play it like a Final Fantasy game and do the grinding and level your characters and mix and match your materia. For me, the thread, that really tangled thread that's really good, kind of gets lost in the blockbuster in the blockbuster action movie vibe of the game. It's almost like the game is so big that it obscures its small moments, which is interesting, because part of the questions are like, hey, what are some small moments you remember? So far in my interviews, Final Fantasy 1 through 6, everyone's got them. Like, oh yeah, this moment, that moment. This game, Sephiroth stabbed Aerith, and there's a cold saucer, and then there's the life stream, and but there are so many cool grace notes in this game. But again, it feels like a Marvel movie. What's your take on the story of Final Fantasy VII?
Oh, goodness. It's a jumble mess when you look at it now. So it was it's a halfway point thing with the story. I was so much into it until Aerith got killed. And once Aerith got killed off and Cloud started having his mental breakdown, it kind of lost me for the rest of the game, because I'm just like, what am I doing now? I know it is to go after Sephiroth, but I'm like, it was just a confusing mess after that. And everything, because, they're playing around with flashbacks, what is real and what is not. They try to add Zeka to it. Is this vision right? What's the truth about Cloud's background and everything? And it was just like, it really felt like you guys had everything great going to after, to the point where Aerith died. And then now it feels like, that you guys just started making up the script of the rest of the game. Like, you started making up the story and everything. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to see this all the way through. Even with Red 13 and Vincent and all of that, and see how it plays out. And then it just felt like, even when I got to the ending, I kind of felt like I was robbed of it.
Interesting.
With it. Yeah.
And I wonder if that's because you did mention after Aerith goes, that's when everything kind of started going narratively south for you, it sounds like.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that's the symptom of having such a heartbreaking moment that can overshadow everything in that game. Because when you talk to people about Final Fantasy VII, even those who played it back in the day, the big talk is always about like that opening and Sephiroth and Cloud. And I'm kind of repeating myself a little bit here, but there are so many other stories in that game that are actually really cool if you look at it just as a chronological story.
Yes.
But I think the way I described it in other interviews is that if like Final Fantasy 6 or 4 is this straight line story with branching paths that'll link back up, it's the story of Final Fantasy 7 is like the second season of Loki, like the strands of time, this big jumbled mess. Like it's a cylinder and it goes from beginning to end. But there are so many things interwoven within it. It's just dense and hard to pull apart when you're in the middle of also grinding for levels and figuring out your materia and doing all that stuff. It gets lost.
It's because the thing about it, you feel like what really took over Final Fantasy VII after Aerith, and as she passed away, is now Red 13's story. It should have been that, because, trying to get the dad back in, trying to stop. There should have been a better revenge plot against Sephiroth, but it didn't feel that way. And so with that, I really felt like Hojo should have really stepped in and became something that the game focused on, and everything, and be like, you are the cause of this, and then finish Hojo and then go on to Sephiroth and everything. But it just felt like they spent so much time on Cloud and his mental state that it just didn't play well, and everything. Like, it didn't play off into moving what the game set up to be, and stuff. Like, I think if Cloud was having more mental issues in the beginning, instead of then just be like, oh, he fell into the mental thing, give him all the mental issues and everything, and call it a day.
Right.
Like, it felt rushed. So it kind of feels just like it wasn't balanced after the half of the other part of the game before you got to the conclusion and stuff.
So I think that makes a lot of sense. And I remember feeling the same way when I played it Again, 15 years ago, whatever it was. And definitely when I tried to replay it now, it's got a lot of cool stuff in there. There really is some cool stuff.
I will say this. Final Fantasy VII gave us the name Active Time Battle, which I think Retronauts ended up calling it because of that, ATB. And I love the fact that, the material system was easy to use and you get your powers. Like Final Fantasy VII, I put about 69 plus 70 hours in that game because I was grinding everything. I didn't really fight the 3 monsters to get the ultimate sword, and I didn't do all of the side quests and stuff. I think when I got to the point where I'm 75 levels, I could go ahead and fight Sephiroth.
You're good, yeah.
So I kind of was good with that. The ending of this game, and so spoilers for anybody who hasn't played Final Fantasy VII, or we're just talking about it. But if you haven't seen it, I would still say go play the game to see the build up that led to this ending. The reason I felt that I was robbed of this ending, why I say that, is that I love the fact that Holy was stopping Meteor, but it wasn't enough. And so the live stream came and you see Aerith part of the live stream with it. And it was such a pleasant surprise that, even though her body was gone, her spirit and her power was still there. It was in the earth now. It was part of where, it was part of the live stream to help fight off Meteor. And that was really cool. And then it jumped 500 years and it's just you see this ending. I'm like, no, I want to know what happened with the people. I'm like, you can't jump 500 years. I don't care about all of this nonsense. Of course they're going to be dead and gone. Of course the city's going to look a mess, but I wanted to know what happened after they defeated Sephiroth. How did they get back? Did they all go their separate ways or what? Did, Cloud go back to his home, or did he go back to the, not go to Saucer, Heaven's, the bar?
Right. Yes. Yeah.
Where did Cloud go? Because I want to know, how did he get these 7 swords and everything? They don't explain that. They were just 500 years. You see this place, where the game really takes place and stuff. Why do I want to say Metropolis and it's not Metropolis?
I know. That's fair. So it's a fair point. Yeah.
So it was just I just felt like I didn't get a satisfactory ending. That ending felt rushed after after Cloud and Sephiroth fight and you defeat Sephiroth. I felt like I wanted to know what happened to the characters after.
Yeah. And that's really interesting because in other Final Fantasy games, you get that closure. You get that closure in Final Fantasy IV. You get a bit of it. 6 is phenomenal with it. It gives you, it feels like it ties everything together, and future ones do too. But you're right. 7 just kind of ends. And then it's 500 years later, you got Red 7 or 13 looking above the shattered Midgar and
Midgar. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's basically, that's it. I think you're right. I think it doesn't allow for those narrative things to close. And I think other properties have tried to close those. I've never played any of the side stuff. I never played Dirge of Cerberus. I never did play any of the other Final Fantasy VII stuff. But and I've seen the movie many years ago. I haven't seen it since. You're right. I think I can see why you would say it's disappointing because it leaves a lot of the narrative and the character things, the character beats unresolved, where Final Fantasy was better at that in previous entries.
Yes, correct.
That makes sense. Six episodes down, a few more to go. Just a few, I think, as we continue exploring Final Fantasy VII. We have a couple more to go, and I think they're going to be interesting experiments in just, again, diving into this game and seeing what makes it tick. Hope you've been enjoying this very exhaustive 2 months of content. It's been a lot of fun exploring this game and really hearing these stories of how Final Fantasy VII affected people back in the day and even right now. Thank you, as always, to Pete, Harney, and Kev from the Discord for helping me cut up these interviews and creating the clips that make up these main episodes. Your help is greatly appreciated. Thank you again to my patrons for your financial support, and thank you for listening to this edition of A Gamer Looks at 40. And until next time, just be kind to yourselves and each other.